This is part 3 of the Trappist Incident Book 1 in R.M. Stratton's military science fiction series, Concord Horizon. If you enjoy the audiobook, the link to the ebook available on Amazon is in the description. 31. Powder Keg. Leniania did not resemble Earth exactly, but it echoed it. Broad glacial plains stretched beneath a pale sky, broken by rugged highlands and river valleys carved over millennia by forces that had not consulted anyone's preferences. The air was colder and thinner than Earth's, but alive in a way that felt familiar, ancient in the way places feel ancient when something in them predates the memory of the species that now inhabits them. The Lenians had adapted to it across an unbroken history, and in the heart of one of their great settlements, the Human Coalition Embassy stood as something both foreign and carefully intentional, stone and glass, angular Lenian construction, softened by human design instincts. Wide open spaces drawn from Earth's diplomatic tradition, layered against materials that referenced a shared prehistory neither species had fully understood when they first encountered each other. The walls inside told that story without being asked to. Murals of prehistoric Earth, with human and early Lenian ancestors moving through the same landscapes without knowing each other. Below those, modern imagery, joint expeditions, scientific cooperation, the visual language of an alliance that was real without being simple. Ambassador Amelia Schneider stood at the central table, with her hands resting lightly on its surface. She looked considerably younger than she was, in the way that medical access had made possible for most people who had reached her generation. Her eyes, though, carried the decades that her face did not show. Across from her sat two representatives. The Lenian diplomatic envoy Karos was massive even while seated, his frame built for a world that had always demanded more from its inhabitants than Earth ever had. His movements were slow and deliberate in the way of someone who had learned that precision mattered more than speed. Beside him, the children ambassador Hulkson presented the contrast that children's always presented: smaller, sharper eyes in constant motion, processing everything in the room simultaneously. Near the edge of the space, Captain Chloe Carpenter stood as naval attaché and observer, the person responsible for translating military reality into diplomatic language when the gap between them became too wide to ignore. Schneider did not waste time on approach. Singapore has arrived in the Wolf 359 system and is holding position under stealth. They are awaiting two arrivals, a Miri envoy and Concord warden Volkson. She let that establish itself before continuing. The intent is to return the Miri male to his species, voluntarily, without conditions. Karras inclined his head. A necessary act. Also a calculated one, Schneider said. Carpenter stepped forward slightly. Captain Hansen is operating under broad authority. He has been given latitude to resolve the situation as he sees fit. Holkson's attention sharpened. That is unusual. He's an unusual officer, Carpenter said, with the precision of someone choosing understatement deliberately. Schneider continued. There is also the matter of his potential induction into the Concord Wardens. Volkson is en route partly to conduct that evaluation. That landed with more weight than the words themselves carried. Karos shifted slightly. A human? Yes. Volkson did not react outwardly, but something in his gaze changed. Schneider activated the display. A single word appeared between them. Eden. A new artifact has been discovered there. The room changed immediately, as rooms do when the variable that was already making everyone uncomfortable grows significantly. Eden is an independent settlement, Schneider continued. Self-governing, with a council that elects its own leadership and conducts its own internal affairs without coalition representation. Its population is largely human, but organized along lines that have nothing to do with coalition structure. Carpenter stepped in. Luddite communities, religious sects, isolationist groups, most cap their technology at an early 21st century equivalent. Some go considerably further back by choice, 19th century methods, beasts of burden, manual labor, no external connectivity. Holkson tilted his head slightly. By choice. Entirely, Schneider confirmed. Karos leaned back. They reject advancement. They reject dependency, Schneider corrected gently but firmly. Most of these communities coexist without conflict. They leave each other alone and expect the same in return. But an artifact changes that, Carpenter said. The room understood without elaboration. Access, power, disruption, 3 words that did not need sentences around them. There is one further detail of their political status that bears on what we can and cannot do, Schneider said. Eden is independent, but it is not unaffiliated. It retains protectorate status under the Coalition. The Coalition does not govern internal affairs and has no standing in their council. But Eden uses Coalition courier infrastructure when it needs to communicate off-world, and in exchange the Coalition retains the right to act on Eden's behalf, or on Eden's territory, when something arises that affects regional stability. Karos considered that. An artifact under their soil qualifies. It does. Captain Hansen has standing to deploy there. He will not be violating sovereignty. Holkson's voice stayed calm. That consideration will not constrain others. That is precisely our concern, Carpenter said. She moved closer to the table. Hansen will go to Eden immediately after Wolf 359. He will not wait for additional consensus or further authorization. He will assess the situation and decide on the ground. Karos studied her. He will act unilaterally. Yes, that is why he was chosen. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable so much as weighted. The kind of silence that settled over a room when everyone present was working through the same implications simultaneously. Carpenter let it breathe for a moment, then added the piece that mattered most. And he will not be the only one moving toward Eden. Schneider did not interrupt. Our intelligence indicates Three-Heel has already been briefed. He met with Sarek Val at Sagittarius I on Anchor Station. If Three-Heel is orienting toward Eden, this situation is no longer contained. It becomes a race, and the prize at the end of it is an artifact that nobody on Eden has any framework for understanding. Holkson spoke quietly. It becomes a contest. Yes. Karos's voice dropped. And the inhabitants of Eden will not understand any of what is coming toward them, Schneider finished. A world that had made a principled choice to remain simple, about to be intersected by forces, artifacts, wardens, rogue actors, competing intelligence networks, that its entire social structure had been built to avoid. She looked between both ambassadors. This is a diplomatic powder keg, and the fuse is already burning. No one in the room disagreed. There was not a credible counter-argument available. Outside, Leniania's cold winds moved across ground that had been ancient when humanity was still learning to make fire on a different world. Inside, 3 species sat with a future, none of them fully controlled, making the kind of careful partial plans that were all any of them had to offer. Far away, in the Wolf 359 system, the first pieces were already in position, waiting for the moment when waiting ended. 32. Exchange. Wolf 359 looked empty. That did not mean it was. 2 inbound contacts, Bishop said, with the calm she reserved for things significant enough to require it. 1 small signature matching Concord Warden profile. 2nd is larger. Configuration consistent with Miri transport. I leaned forward in the chair. There they are. On the forward display, 2 contacts burned against the black. One precise and controlled, the other carrying something different in its movement, alive in a way that ship signatures do not usually suggest but occasionally do. Time to intercept, Hernandez asked. Negative, hold position, and let them come to us. This was not a fight, and I did not want anything about our approach suggesting otherwise. 2 incoming communications, Bishop added. Simultaneous. Put them up. The display split. Left side, clean, structured, encoded with an authorization chain that resolved to Concord Warden Volkson. Right side, a hail with no standard format, no familiar communication structure. Miri vessel requesting contact, Bishop said. Confirm both. Priority is the exchange. I kept my eyes on the display. This matters more than anything else happening right now. No one argued. They all knew it was true. I turned slightly. Himura, get your patient ready for transfer and bring him to the airlock. Meet me there with Hernandez. Hernandez shifted. Captain, no marine detail? No. She did not hide that she did not like it. With respect, this is a diplomatic exchange with an unknown species and an incoming warden. We should... Dovere, no provere. A beat. Hernandez looked at me. Kimov looked up from the rear station with the closest thing to amusement his register allowed. Trust but verify, Kimov translated. Hernandez exhaled through her nose. I'm familiar with the phrase. Then you know the rest of it, I said. She held my gaze for a moment, did not agree, but... Aye, Captain. Marines on standby, out of sight, out of the room. The second we look like a threat, we become one. Understood, Kimov answered immediately. Helm, bring us alongside the Mary vessel. Manual control. Aye, Bishop said. The ship moved slowly and precisely. The Mary vessel did not maneuver the way ours did. It held position with the stillness of something that had decided to trust us to close the distance correctly. No pressure in it, just expectation. Their docking interface doesn't match ours, Bishop said, hands already adjusting. Give me a moment. The seconds stretched in the way they stretched when failure was not just a technical problem. If this did not work, we were not missing a docking. We were breaking something that had taken considerable effort to build. Almost there. A soft tone. Seal achieved. A subtle shift moved through the ship as the tunnel extended and locked. Airlock ready, Captain. I was already standing. Bridge is yours. Aye. Hernandez fell in beside me without a word. We moved quickly, not rushed, but deliberate, because moments like this do not forgive fumbling. The airlock chamber was quiet when we arrived. Himura was already there, and the Miri alongside her, supported by the harness system we had built around him over the past several days. The improvised hammock had done its job. He looked better than he had when we pulled him out of that frozen facility. Still strained, still carrying the fragility of someone who had been through something significant, but present in a way he had not been at first. He was holding something in one of his manipulators, a small data drive. I looked at Himura. Gibby's movie library? He insisted. Of course he did. I almost smiled. All right, let's do this. The outer hatch cycled. Atmosphere equalized. The inner hatch opened. The Miri envoy stood on the other side. She was different, not just physically, though she was that too. It was presence, a calm and focus that communicated itself before any words could. Her escort remained behind her on the vessel. That was deliberate, and I noted it. I stepped forward. Welcome aboard Singapore. Not formal, not stiff, just honest. She regarded me, then Himura, then the male. No words, but something passed between the two Miri that did not move through the air the way communication usually does. The male shifted slightly, and then he spoke. Not out loud, not exactly, but the meaning arrived anyway, forming somewhere that was not quite hearing. He was telling her everything. What had been done to him. What we had done for him. The full account of it, delivered in whatever medium the hive mind used when it reached across the gap between individuals. I did not move. Did not interrupt. This part was not ours. When it ended, the envoy turned back to us. Her voice, when it came, was filtered through the translator. I am not accustomed to verbal communication, but I understand. That's good enough. She studied Himura briefly, then me. The Queen has assigned me to accompany you, as an observer. A beat. No interference, no action, only observation. I nodded. Fair. I stepped aside. Himura guided the male forward with the gentleness she brought to everything that required it. He paused once at the threshold and turned slightly toward us. Gratitude, not spoken, but unmistakable. The kind that does not need language because language would only reduce it. Then he crossed over. Back to his people. Back to where he belonged. The envoy remained on our side. The hatch cycled closed, the seal engaged, and just like that the exchange was done. I let out a breath I had not noticed I was holding. Hernandez glanced at me. That went well. Yeah, for once it actually did. Captain, Bishop over the comm, go ahead. Concord Warden shuttle is requesting landing clearance. I looked at Hernandez, then at Himura. Round 2. Clear them in. The shuttle bay was already crowded. Our own craft, the bucket of bolts, occupying its corner with characteristic gracelessness. Equipment staged for rapid deployment. The Warden shuttle came in with the clean precision of everything I was beginning to suspect defined Volkson as an operator. It settled onto the deck without drama. The ramp lowered. Concord Warden Volkson stepped onto my ship. Alone. No entourage, no hesitation, just the quality of presence that made a small figure fill a large space. And just like that, the situation stopped being complicated and became official. 33. Acceleration. The Fang cut through the dark with the purposefulness of a ship that had never been designed for anything else. Unlike coalition vessels, it did not move with restraint. Hard lines, angular construction, systems tuned for dominance rather than comfort. It advanced through space the way everything Kalar was built to advance, as though the void itself was simply the next obstacle in a long sequence of obstacles that had all eventually yielded. Deep within it, Three Heel stood before an assembled force. The largest compartment on the ship had been cleared. Not for ceremony, not for tradition, for purpose. Brown dwarfs filled the space in the silence of people who had learned that watching and listening first was how you stayed alive long enough to be useful. Human, Kalar, Lenian, mercenaries, enforcers, survivors of enough situations that survival itself had become a kind of credential. They did not shift or speak. They watched, because when Thrio called them together, it meant something was about to change and you paid attention to that. He stood at the center. Still, measured. Then he began. The humans, he said, his voice carrying easily without being raised, should still be confined to their home system. No one moved. They were not ready, not sufficiently advanced, not unified, not significant by any metric the rest of the galaxy uses to assess emerging species. A pause. And then they found it. He let that sit for a moment. A crashed vessel on their own moon. An artifact built from technology they did not create and could not fully comprehend. They did not understand it. Another step forward, they reverse-engineered it, and in fewer than 100 of their years they advanced 300. The room absorbed that, because the number was not evolution. It was acceleration of a kind that had no natural explanation, and everyone present understood it. That is not organic development, Three Heel said. That is intervention. He began to move slowly across the space, letting the movement punctuate what he was saying. After that, they expanded. They made first contact, in a system they now call Eden. He let the name land before continuing. A brief but significant engagement. The humans called it the Eden Incident. A faint edge entered his voice. The Kalar call it the Great Shame. A low shift moved through the Kalar present. Not disagreement, but recognition of something that carried weight. It was the first time the Kalar withdrew from a confrontation, not because they were outmatched, because the cost of continuing exceeded the value of the objective. He paused. My pack alpha was there. He led a boarding element, one of the ships that pushed forward when others hesitated. He did not agree with the withdrawal order. A shorter pause. He died before he could formally challenge it. The room understood what that meant without being told. It was not delivered as grief. Threeheel did not perform grief. He delivered the sentence as a fact in a longer accounting, one item in a record of consequences, placed where it belonged in the chain of cause and effect that produced the moment they were all standing in. The Pack Alpha had not died as a tragedy. He had died as a marker, and Threeheel was identifying the marker so the room could see how far the line ran. That moment changed the Kalar's relationship with expansion, and it marked the beginning of humanity's presence in this region. He turned. They found the Children's next, a species that values order and equilibrium above most things. They aligned with them. He continued moving. Then the Lineans, a population removed from Earth long before extinction could claim them, relocated by an unknown agency, developed separately. And now, by an irony, nobody has fully stopped to examine humanity's closest allies in this region of space. He stopped. They build relationships. They integrate. They extend influence in every direction simultaneously. And then they find more. His gaze hardened. Another artifact in the Trappist system, and now a cipher, a key on Eden. The room did not move. The pattern, laid out in sequence, was no longer possible to dismiss as coincidence. That means one of two things, Threeheel said, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted something to stay with people. Either they are extraordinarily fortunate, more fortunate than any species in recorded contact history, or they are being guided, deliberately, by something capable of placing artifacts, relocating populations, and accelerating development across generations. He looked across the assembled faces. And for reasons we do not understand, whatever that something is appears to favor humanity above every other species in this region. Silence stretched across the compartment. An unknown intelligence with a preference. That is the most dangerous variable any of us has ever encountered. We cannot negotiate with it. We cannot confront it. We cannot even locate it. He straightened. What we can address is the consequence of its preference. He stepped forward. Humanity is developing too quickly, too unpredictably. In a century, they went from a single-system species to a rising interstellar power with alliances across 3 other species, Concord Warden candidacy under discussion, and a pattern of artifact, discoveries no other civilization has come close to replicating. His voice sharpened. If that trajectory continues unchecked, they will dominate this region. Not through malice necessarily, through momentum. And when they reach that point, they will not ask permission from the species they have surpassed. No one in the room disagreed. Not because they were afraid to, because the logic held. They must be stopped, Threeheel said. Not defeated, not destroyed. A deliberate pause. Stopped. At a point where the balance of this region can still be maintained, before the acceleration becomes irreversible. He said it without hesitation and without visible doubt, the conclusion of a calculation he had been running for longer than this moment. delivered to people he needed to move in the same direction. Outside the hull, the Fang held its course. Eden ahead, a world that had made a principled communal decision to reject the speed of progress, now about to be forced into contact with the full weight of what that progress had produced. An artifact buried beneath its soil, multiple parties converging on it, and a man who had decided that the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy was not any weapon or any fleet. It was a species that someone, somewhere had decided to invest in, and that investment had gone far enough. 34. Common ground. The Situation Room sat just aft of the bridge, close enough for quick decisions, far enough that you could think without the constant operational hum of the command deck working against you. Right now it was full. Every chair taken, every wall display active. Hernandez, Himura, Bishop, Fevai, Kimov, Varos, and 2 additions that changed the entire character of the room. The Miri Envoy, and Concord Warden Volkson. That last one still felt strange, and I was honest enough with myself to admit it, not because he was imposing in the way people expect when they imagine a warden. He was quiet and controlled, which in my experience was considerably more unsettling than imposing. I stood at the head of the table. Before we get into anything else, I looked at the Miri Envoy. "Do you have a name?" The room went still. Simple question, not a simple answer. She regarded me with the attention of someone deciding how much to engage with a premise that did not quite fit her experience. "I do," she said through the translator, measured and deliberate, "but not in a form your species would readily process." That tracked. Hive mind, shared identity, no functional need for individual labels in any context she had ever existed within before this one. I nodded. "Can we use something simpler? Just so we are not saying the envoy every 30 seconds. I thought about it for half a second. A couple of heads turned slightly around the table. Minimal, functional. Works for me, she considered it. Then, that is acceptable. Good. Welcome aboard, E. No ceremony, no extended moment, just moving forward, which felt right. Hernandez. She was already set. Eden. The display populated. The planet rotating slowly, green and dense and alive in the way that worlds with genuine biodiversity look different from the ones that have been managed and terraformed into something approximating life. Independent world, self-governing council, no coalition representation in their internal affairs. Population predominantly human, organized along lines that have nothing to do with coalition structure. Luddite communities. Religious sects, self-imposed technological limits across the board. A brief pause. Worth flagging for our guests, Eden retains protectorate status under the coalition. We have standing to operate there. We are not violating sovereignty. Volkson gave the smallest nod. He inclined her head once. Both registered the information and moved on. Fevai picked up the thread. Technological development varies significantly by community. Some maintain early 21st century equivalents. Others operate at 19th century levels. She shifted the display to a specific region, coastal, clifftop, the geography suggesting what the Italian Riviera might have looked like before it got complicated by the 21st century. The community that discovered the ciphers in this area. 19th century technology by deliberate doctrinal choice. Define the community. A Christian sect, Fevai said. Technology limits are religiously grounded. Polygamous structure. Each male may take up to 5 wives. Varos looked at the display with the expression of someone processing an engineering problem that had more variables than expected. That is structurally complex. Not our concern, Hernandez said, which was the correct position. What we do not know, Fevai continued, is whether the cipher has been moved since discovery. Location, security, and current condition are all unknown. Unknown location, unknown security, unknown timeline. Same as always. I had stopped being surprised by that configuration. Kimov leaned forward. By choice? Still apparently working through the technology question. Entirely deliberate, Fevi confirmed. I stepped forward slightly. All right, mission is straightforward, even if the execution will not be. That got the room's full attention. We recover the cipher, and we recover the original artifact Thriel took from Trappist 1. No interruptions. Nothing to argue with in the basic premise. It matters to the human coalition. It matters to the Mairi. I glanced at E. She inclined her head slightly in confirmation. I looked at Vrolkson. And it matters to the wardens. He did not react much, just enough. The Lenians have a direct stake in whatever the database contains, given where they came from. The Children's. Fevi nodded once before I finished. Kimov spoke from the side. The Kalar? I exhaled. If Thriel is heading to Eden, and I am operating on the assumption that he is, then yes, they have an interest. That is not a question. That is a guarantee. I checked the chrono display. 48 hours to Eden. Whatever situation is developing on the ground, we are walking into the middle of it. No one disagreed. That was what we did. Get some rest, eat something, make Gibby happy. That got quiet reactions from a few people. Because once we arrive, neither of those things is going to be possible for a while. I looked around the table one last time. Different species, different frameworks, different reasons for being in this room, but the same table, for now, pointed in the same direction. Dismissed. Chairs shifted. The room began to clear, conversations starting in low tones as people moved toward the door. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, looking at Eden on the display. Green. Coastal. Peaceful in the way places are peaceful when they do not yet know what is coming toward them. A community that had made a principled decision to opt out of everything that had produced this ship, this crew, this situation, and in 48 hours we were going to land in the middle of their lives, whether any of us wanted that or not. They were about to become part of something larger than themselves, the same way we all had, eventually, whether they were ready for it or not. 35 off-duty. The galley smelled like someone had made a decision. Not the tentative, improvised cooking smell that came out of ship galleys when someone was working with what they had and hoping for the best. This was deliberate, molten cheese pulling in slow golden ribbons. Beef that had been simmering long enough to stop being meat and start being something with a point of view. Spices that had mellowed into each other until the individual components gave up their separateness and became something richer than any of them had been alone. It was the smell that turned pressed metal and recycled air into somewhere you'd actually chosen to be. The smell that made 48 hours out from a contested planetary insertion feel, briefly, like an evening. Gibby stood under the strip lights with a tray of nachos, placing each chip with the focused attention of a man who had decided that what he was doing constituted serious work. Careful with that, he muttered to nobody in particular, nudging a jalapeno slice a few millimeters to the left. Layering matters. These are load-bearing elements, not decorative ones. I leaned against the bulkhead with my arms crossed. Didn't realize Tex-Mex had a structural engineering component. Everything has a structural engineering component. He didn't look up. You just don't notice until something collapses and you're left wondering what went wrong. He stepped back and regarded the tray. Architecture. The man who invented nachos understood architecture. The full spread was taking shape along the counter. Trays of nachos to Gibby's specifications. Burritos drowning in Rojas sauce. Black beans and rice with lime worked through both until the acid brightened everything around it. At the far end, a flan with a caramel surface that caught the overhead lighting and looked like it had required more work than it probably had, though with Gibby, you never quite knew. He frowned at a smaller portion on the side counter, the children-compatible preparation he'd spent considerably longer on than the rest of the spread combined. "Still bothers me," he said quietly. "Can't taste test it properly. Can't verify it the way I'd verify anything else. Chef's cross-species conundrum. Chef's genuine nightmare." He wiped his hands on the towel at his waist. "I know the nutritional profile is right. I know the preparation followed Feiwei's specifications exactly. I know there's no animal protein in it, and the enzyme compatibility checks out according to the database." He looked at the platter with the expression of a craftsman whose best tool had been taken away. "But I can't tell you whether it tastes like anything worth eating, and that keeps me up at night." She ate the last version. She said acceptable. "I've never in my life put that much effort into something and had the response be acceptable." He shook his head. "I have standards." Bishop had claimed a section of the secondary table with her tablet propped against a water glass, angled toward Varos. He sat across from her with the upright bearing he maintained even off-duty, the kind of posture that made the chair look slightly wrong for him regardless of the chair. On the tablet, a grainy archival image, a man in a business suit, slightly hunched, with a mild expression of grievance. "It's a car insurance commercial," Bishop was saying. "Early 20 to first century. Ran for years. The joke is that a Neanderthal, which is what pre-contact humans called your people's ancestors before we knew they were your people's ancestors, is sophisticated enough to use the company's website." Varos studied the image. "The intended implication is that the interface is simple enough for a primitive human to operate. Right. And this was considered humor." "It was considered humor at the time, yes." "For how long?" "The campaign ran about a decade. It was popular." Varos did not move for a second. Then he tilted his head by a few degrees, the way he did when he was organizing a statement he intended to deliver precisely. "I would like to confirm my understanding. Humans produced a series of advertisements in which a figure representing my species' lineage was depicted as slow-witted. Humans found this funny. Humans continued to find this funny for 10 years. Bishop had apparently not rehearsed the moment from this angle. "When you put it like that, it sounds worse. I have not editorialized. I have summarized." "Yeah, okay, that's fair. Was any member of my species consulted during the production of these advertisements? We were not spacefaring at the time. Only 12 humans had walked on the moon. Our space exploration was limited only to low Earth orbit. The Lenians hadn't been contacted yet. We didn't know you existed." Then the humans responsible were, from their perspective, making a joke about an extinct ancestor of their own species. "Yes. And from our current perspective, they were making a joke about the ancestors of an allied species whose FTL drive you currently rely on to move between stars." "When you put it like that," Bishop said, "it also sounds worse." He returned his attention to the tablet. "Your ancestors and mine shared Earth at the time this aired. You simply did not know it." "We didn't. The genetic match had not been made." "No." Therefore, the caveman in the advertisement was, in fact, a reasonably accurate depiction of a pre-modern Lenian ancestor. The inaccuracy lies only in the implied cognitive limitations. I almost laughed. Bishop did not, which required visible effort. Varos studied the image for another moment. "I maintain the FTL drive. he said, in the flat tone he used for statements he considered self-evident. Bishop blinked. What? I maintain the linear FTL drive that allows this vessel to travel between star systems. The interface I work with requires understanding of spatial geometry, relativistic mechanics, and the material properties of the drive crystal under sustained operation. A pause. I believe this exceeds the caveman's design parameters. That's a fair point. Thank you, Varos said, with the tone of someone not entirely sure whether they had made a joke, but willing to accept the response. Bishop looked at me. He's doing that thing again where I can't tell if he's being dry or completely literal. Both, I said. Usually both. Varos returned his attention to the tablet with the expression of someone who had said what needed to be said, and was now ready to move on. Then, without looking up, I would like a copy of the advertisement for my records. Bishop paused. All of them. All of them. Okay, the main table was a disaster. Not a loud disaster. A quiet, inevitable one. The kind that produces itself gradually through the combination of Favi playing Monopoly and everyone else at the table having made the mistake of sitting down across from her. The board had been out for 40 minutes. The asymmetry was what you got when one player had been treating the game as an optimization problem from the first turn, and everyone else had been treating it as something to do before dinner. Are you certain about that trade? Hernandez asked, voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer. Favi moved her piece without looking up. Yes. Himura studied the board with the focus she brought to diagnostics. That's a fairly aggressive position. It is the optimal position, Favi replied, in the same tone she used to report sensor data. Not arrogance, just the delivery of someone who had run the calculation and was sharing the result. Hernandez leaned back. You've been describing everything as optimal for the last 25 minutes. And I have been correct each time. I pulled up a stool at the end of the table, far enough to observe without being drawn in. Himura glanced sideways. Observation post? Learning what not to do? A small smile appeared and disappeared in the space of 2 seconds. Then Favi, without looking up. Rent? Hernandez closed her eyes. Of course it is. The property development sequence I selected in rounds 2 through 4 has reached the return phase, Favi explained helpfully. I understand how Monopoly works. You appear to. The execution has been the challenge. Hernandez looked at the board, then at Favi, then at me. I kept my expression neutral. Near the galley counter, E stood in her observing position, not participating, but present. She had been watching Gibby work for most of the evening, watching the Monopoly game, watching Bishop and Varos with the tablet, building her picture. She had been doing this since she came aboard, and it had stopped feeling unusual, which was itself an interesting development in how a crew adapted to the permanent presence of someone whose explicit function was to evaluate them. I reached for the water pitcher and refilled Himura's glass without thinking about it. She accepted without breaking her focus on the board, a quiet thank you directed at the middle distance. Small rituals. The accumulation of them was something you only noticed obliquely, when you caught yourself doing something without having decided to do it. Favi set down her token and looked up. Her expression had the quality it carried when she had organized an observation and was preparing to deliver it. I have noted a pattern, she said. Hernandez, without looking up. Here we go. Favi's attention moved to me, then to Himura, with the completeness of a sensor sweep. Both of you display consistent behavioral indicators associated with pair bonding across multiple independent observation contexts. A small pause. For scientific purposes, and I want to be clear that I am asking in the spirit of genuine inquiry. Would you be willing to permit observation of your mating behavior?" The galley went silent in the way spaces go silent when everyone present has received information that requires a moment to process. Varos looked up from his tablet with an expression that suggested the question had briefly suspended his relationship with the concept of gravity. Himura sat still. Gibby, to his credit, did not drop the spatula. He continued watching with unchanged focus. I set my water glass down. "If that ever becomes relevant, the answer is no." Himura's voice arrived at the same instant. "No." Favai inclined her head. "Understood. The refusal is itself informative." She looked back at the board. "Your turn, Hernandez." Varos stood up. The movement had the decisive quality of someone who had identified an alternative location and was committing to it. "I should verify the FTL drive status." Bishop looked at him. "It's completely stable." "Yes, I will confirm that independently." He moved through the doorway with what could only be described as dignified urgency. "Good instincts," I said. Gibby cleared his throat. "Food is ready. Everybody find a spot." The room exhaled. Chairs scraped. Plates appeared. Conversation returned to the room with the careful quality of people who had agreed, without discussing it, to relocate to safer ground. Hernandez stood and reached for a plate. "I'm never playing that game with her again." Favai tilted her head. Repeated exposure typically improves performance. Hernandez took her nachos and moved to a different section of the table without responding. This was, in its way, also a kind of response. Himura materialized at my elbow as I moved down the serving line. "You all right?" I asked. "Yes." A brief pause. "That was unexpected." "She's direct." "Very." Another pause, this one with something more considered in it. "She's also not wrong about the observation. She simply has a different relationship with what constitutes an appropriate follow-up inquiry." That's a very diplomatic way to describe what just happened. I'm a ship's physician on a prototype diplomatic vessel. Diplomacy is professionally indicated. The faint smile again. Brief, real. We moved to the table with the rest of the crew. Trays settling, voices finding their normal register, the room returning to its ordinary version of itself. Gibby had moved to the edge of the table nearest the galley, his default position, close enough to monitor the food, present enough to be part of whatever was happening. E had moved from her counter position to the room's periphery, still watching, closer now, in the way she sometimes moved closer when the social dynamics of the space had shifted into something she was finding worth narrower observation. Less than 48 hours to Eden. Whatever was waiting there, Three-Heel, the artifact, a community that had deliberately chosen to live outside everything this ship represented, was waiting with the patience of things that did not know they were being approached. Right now there was nachos and Monopoly, and Varos's dignity, and Gibby's refusal to accept, acceptable, as a sufficient outcome for something he'd cooked. Right now, there was this. And I'd learned enough on this operation to recognize that this was not a small thing, whatever came next. So we ate, and for a little while the galaxy was quiet enough to let us. 36 approach. 24 hours out from Eden. Close enough that it stopped being theoretical. You could feel the difference in the ship, in the way people moved through the corridors with more purpose and less conversation, in the quality of the silences between stations, in the kind of focus that settles over a crew when the planning phase is ending. The execution phase was beginning to make itself felt. The situation room was full, same faces, same stakes, considerably less time. I stood at the head of the table with my hands resting on the edge, looking at the terrain map rotating slowly in front of us. Coastal settlement on the cliff tops, the sea visible beyond it, 3 main access routes cutting through the surrounding landscape. Simple on paper. It was always simple on paper. What the paper did not show was the texture of it. The blind corners, the buildings that provided cover for the wrong side, the sight lines that looked clean on a scan and turned out to be anything but once you were on the ground. All right, let's lock this in. What we decide in the next 10 minutes is what we're executing in 24 hours, so take it seriously. No one spoke. That was correct. This was the part where talking stopped being discussion and started being decisions with weight behind them. I tapped the display, and the terrain map shifted to show the 3 approach vectors highlighted in different colors. Inland road, coastal north, coastal south. We're coming in from 3 directions simultaneously. Cut off movement in and out. Control the ground. Close in from the perimeter toward the objective. I marked each landing point. We land here, here, and here. We don't know if 3 Heel is already on the ground or still inbound. Either scenario has different problems. Hernandez's eyes moved across the map with the efficiency of someone who had been doing tactical planning long enough to see the angles without being told where to look. Containment. Exactly. If he's not there yet, we establish the perimeter before he arrives. And he's landing into a situation he doesn't control. If he's already there, I paused. Then we're breaking into a situation he does control, which is why we don't get to choose the wrong assumption. Worst case is the only assumption worth planning for. Nobody at the table argued. Nobody ever argued that point once you had been in enough situations where optimism cost people. I moved to the first marker. I take the inland road, the bucket of bolts. Varos shifted slightly at the name. Same reaction he had every time. He had not entirely reconciled himself to it, and I had stopped expecting him to. Varos, you're with me. Kimov, you too. 2 Marines. Both gave the short, definitive nod that meant understood and ready, rather than the longer nod that meant understood and thinking about it. Inland approach gives us the most flexibility once we're on the ground. It also puts us closer to the field where the artifact was found, which is most likely where this converges, regardless of what else is happening. I moved to the second vector. Hernandez, standard shuttle, coastal north. Kimov's 2nd Marine goes with you. Understood, she said, eyes still on the map. Your job is to control the northern access and watch for movement trying to use the coastline to flank the settlement. If 3 Heel's people are already in position, the coastal approaches are how they'd extend their perimeter. She nodded once. She had already worked it out. Hernandez did not need things explained, so much as confirmed. I marked the 3rd point. Vrolksen, south coastal route. He did not move or respond visibly, which I had learned over the past several days to read as active agreement rather than a lack of engagement. Favai goes with you. That produced a fractional reaction from Varos, the slight recalibration of someone with a professional objection deciding whether this was the moment to raise it. She's the right fit for that team, I said before the moment could develop. Vrolksen's approach requires someone who can interface with the artifact quickly if we reach it from the south before the other teams. Favai is the fastest analyst we have for that specific problem. Matter of fact, a capability decision, not a judgment about anyone else. Favai inclined her head. Understood. Vrolksen said nothing, which had become his standard form of agreement. I looked at Himura. You're with my team. Medical support. She nodded immediately, without hesitation, the kind of acknowledgement from someone who had already anticipated the assignment and prepared for it. Expect civilian casualties. That shifted something in the room. No surprise. Everyone at this table had already run the same calculation about what a ground operation in a 19th century civilian settlement looked like when a former Concord warden arrived with a contracted mercenary force. The shift was something else. The difference between knowing a thing and saying it. I don't care what technology they run or don't run. These are people who didn't choose any of this, and they're going to be in the middle of it because we couldn't resolve this situation before it reached their doorstep. They get the same treatment they would get anywhere else. Himura met my eyes. I understand. 2 words, no elaboration, and I believed every syllable of them. I turned to E. You stay aboard Singapore. Sensors, data uplinks, everything you can gather from orbit. I want a second set of eyes on the whole picture from above while we're down in the middle of it. A pause. If you see something we can't see from the ground, I need to know. Understood, she said, with the careful precision the translator always gave her words. I looked at Bishop last, deliberately. She was holding the ship while the rest of us went into something uncertain, and that assignment deserved to be acknowledged as what it was. You're in command while we're on the ground. Aye, Captain. No hesitation, no visible objection, just the clean acknowledgement of someone who had been ready for this assignment since before I gave it. Geosynchronous orbit, positioned above the settlement, but not visible. Stealth stays the priority. I don't want anyone on the surface knowing we're up there unless we make a specific decision to change that. If the situation deteriorates to the point where we need the ship to be known, I'll call it. Until then, maintain the profile. I looked at her steadily. Watch for inbound traffic, specifically anything that looks like Kalar design or anything matching Three Hills shuttle vector. If the Fang shows up while we're on the ground, I need to know the second it drops out of FTL. I'll be watching, you'll know. I believed her too. Bishop at the helm of Singapore in stealth orbit was about as reliable a capability as this operation had. What happened on the ground was uncertain. What she would do up there was not. I looked at the map one more time. The 3 converging approach vectors, the settlement at their intersection, the field just beyond it where the artifact had been uncovered by an ox-drawn plow, and a family that had no context for what they had found. Ground rules once were down. Cover to cover, controlled movement, no rushing, and no improvising that hasn't been thought through first. We don't get sloppy because things get loud. Loud is when discipline matters most. I tapped the field location. The cipher is there, or it was there. We reach it, we secure it, and we assess from that position. Everything else organizes around that objective. A pause, because the next part needed to land clearly. If Three Hill is already there, we deal with him. That's not a contingency in the plan. That's the most likely version of what we're walking into, based on everything we know about his timeline and his resources. He has faster intelligence than we do on Eden specifically, which means he may have had more preparation time. We go in assuming he's there, and we're pleasantly surprised if he's not. The room absorbed that. Everyone at this table had some version of Three Hill in their working memory by now. The Ice Moon extraction, the field confrontation at Trappist 1, the pattern of someone who was competent and motivated and had not once underestimated the stakes. Questions? Silence. Good silence, the kind that meant everyone had what they needed rather than the kind that meant people were holding back. Then that's the plan? Get some rest? Eat something? A brief look from Himura at the last directive. I mean it. Once we hit atmosphere, the next opportunity for either of those is on the other side of whatever this turns into. The room dispersed the way good crews dispersed. Chairs moving. People collecting their things. Quiet conversations starting in the corridor as the immediate work of preparation replaced the broader work of planning. I stayed where I was for a moment after the last person cleared the doorway. Eden rotated slowly on the display. Green and coastal and quiet from this altitude, the settlement invisible at this scale. The field where everything was going to converge, just a patch of terrain among other patches of terrain. The planet looked peaceful in the way objects look peaceful when you're viewing them from a distance that does not yet let the details reach you. 24 hours. I had commanded operations with less preparation and more information. I had also commanded operations with more preparation and less. The honest truth was that we did not know whether Three Heel was already on the ground, did not know the disposition of his forces, if he was, did not know whether the artifact had been moved since the Thompson family uncovered it, and did not know how the community would respond to armed off-worlders arriving on 3 vectors at once. What I knew was the crew behind me. Kemov would hold a perimeter against whatever came at it until told otherwise, or until it was no longer physically possible. Hernandez would manage the northern approach with the tactical intelligence of someone who thought 3 moves ahead and did not get rattled when the first move went sideways. Bishop would keep Singapore invisible until the precise moment when invisible was no longer the right choice. Himura would treat whoever needed treating, regardless of what was happening around her. Favai would tell us what the artifact was doing faster than anyone else could. Varos would keep the bucket of bolts flying through conditions it was not designed for, because that was what he did. Volkson would do whatever Volkson was going to do, and based on everything I had observed, it would be the right thing at the right moment. That was what I actually had to work with. Not the plan, the people executing it. Plans were the frame. The crew was the structure. I turned off the display and headed for the door. 24 hours. Enough time to rest, to eat, to do whatever each of them needed to do before the frame met the structure, and we found out what it held. 37 private space. The ready room was quiet. Not the operational quiet of the bridge running dark or the controlled silence of stealth profile. Those had a purposeful quality to them, an active suppression of noise in service of something. This was different, personal. The kind of quiet that accumulated in a space when it was yours, when nobody needed anything from you, and when the ship was doing what it was built to do without requiring your involvement for a few minutes. I sat at the desk with a tablet in one hand and a peanut butter and strawberry jelly sandwich in the other. Simple and reliable, unlike anything else about this operation. I had been scrolling through my log entries, reviewing decisions that had felt considerably less organized in the making than they looked when committed to text, when the door chimed. "Come in." Himura stepped through. "Hey." Not captain, not doctor, just that. Easy and direct. The register she used when she had decided what kind of conversation this was going to be before she knocked. "Hey, Nara." She moved further into the room with the unhurried quality she brought to spaces she had been in before, and her attention found the shelf near the bulkhead, in the way attention found things it had catalogued and returned to. The Apollo model. She lifted it carefully, turning it in her hands with the focused consideration she gave to anything she decided was worth understanding properly. "Our first real attempt to reach the moon," she said, studying the joined modules. "Command, service, lunar. 3 separate systems that had to work together or none of them worked at all. Not elegant, but it got there. Got them home. A beginning." "Yeah." I leaned back in the chair and looked at the model in her hands. "Kind of like this ship. First command, prototype hull. Systems still being calibrated in real time because nobody has run this specific combination before." I paused. Lenian FTL drive that requires a Lenian engineer to keep functional. Children computer core that needs a children scientist to run at full capacity. A crew trying to make all of it work together without a manual that covers any of this. She looked at me. "It's working. Most of the time." I set the sandwich down. We didn't make it to Trappist in time. Not really. We arrived in time to see what was already gone and to meet Thriel at the tail end of his operation. We pulled the Miri out on a wing and a prayer, barely kept him stable, couldn't even feed him adequately with what we had aboard. I shook my head. And somehow Gibby constructs a diplomatic relationship with him through movie nights and improvised dietary accommodations. That earned a small, genuine smile. We returned him without conditions. And now we have E aboard making judgments about humanity that go directly back to her queen. We have a Concord warden who came aboard to determine whether I'm worth the candidacy the wardens are apparently considering. I picked up the sandwich and set it down again without eating any of it. And we're 12 hours out from Eden, where Thriel may or may not already be on the ground. And where a community that deliberately opted out of everything we represent is about to have us arrive on 3 approach vectors whether they want us or not. I looked at her. No pressure. She set the Apollo model back on the shelf with the same care she had used picking it up. Care that was not performance, just a consistent relationship with objects that meant something. Then she stepped closer, and without any announcement or transition, she reached out and wiped a small smear of strawberry jelly from the corner of my lip with her thumb. Simple, unhurried, completely natural. The gesture of someone who was past the point of asking whether they were allowed to do a thing and was doing it. "You are doing better than okay," she said quietly. I looked at her for a moment, at the steadiness in her, the quality of attention she gave to things she was being honest about, rather than performing an assessment of. That's not the version I give the crew. She waited. She had the patience of someone who understood that sometimes the most useful thing was to hold space for a thing to arrive rather than to reach for it. "Half the time I don't know what I'm doing," I said. "I make the best call available with what I have in the moment, and I hope it doesn't get anyone killed. That's the whole system." The words sat there between us, in the way honest things sit. Heavier than you expect, but lighter once they're out. I've gotten good at not letting it show. The confidence and certainty everyone sees on the bridge is mostly very practiced composure rather than actual certainty. Pete. The way she said it, just that, just my name, flat and direct and carrying everything she intended without embellishment. Most officers would have found a way to fail by now. The Trappist operation, anchor station, the extraction from the ice moon, the Miri exchange, Eden approaching, any one of those situations had enough variables to justify worse outcomes than we have produced. She met my gaze in a way that did not allow for deflection. "You have held this together." "We have held it together." "Yes," she agreed, "but they are holding it together because of how you lead them. That is not a small thing, and it is not nothing." I looked at her for a moment longer. Not as the ship's physician, not as the moral compass that every decision seemed to run through at some point before it was made, just as Nara Himura, who had been more honest with me across this operation than most people I had served with over an entire career, and who I suspected had a more accurate picture of who Peter Hansen actually was than I generally allowed myself to look at directly. "Thank you, I mean that." "I know, that's why I said it." A small pause settled between us, the kind that did not need filling because it was not empty, just giving what had been said room to be what it was. Then I leaned forward. The kiss was gentle at first. Not tentative, neither of us was uncertain about what this was, but careful, the way you are with something that matters. Unhurried. Present. She did not pull back, and neither did I, and after a moment it deepened slightly, before I pulled back enough to look at her properly. "You okay with this?" "Yes," she said, with the clean directness she brought to everything. No qualification, no hedge, just yes. I glanced briefly upward. Probably should do a sweep for any monitoring devices Fevi might have installed in here in the last day. A quiet exhale, almost a laugh, close enough to count. That would require her to have anticipated this specific outcome several hours in advance. She anticipates most things several hours in advance. It's a legitimate concern. Unlikely, Himura said, but not impossible. Pete. Right. I stood and took her hand. Come on. The private quarters were just beyond the ready room, separated by a door that closed out the ship's constant operational presence. The hum of the drive, the cycling of the air systems, the low-grade awareness that you were in a functional vessel moving through space, with people aboard who had things to do. The captain's quarters were the only private space on the ship in any meaningful sense. A function of rank that I had always treated as a professional convenience rather than a privilege, and that felt different now than it usually did. For a while the ship continued without us. That was its own kind of luxury, the knowledge that the systems were running, that Bishop was at the helm, that Singapore was doing what it was built to do and did not need its captain present for any of it. That the next several hours were genuinely ours, in whatever way anything could be genuinely ours this close to Eden. Later, the quiet was different. The quiet of two people in a shared space who had stopped needing to do anything but be there. I lay looking at the ceiling, aware of her breathing, aware of the steady vibration of the drive through the ship's frame, that constant low presence you stopped consciously registering after the first few days aboard, but that was always there, marking time. I found myself talking before I had decided to. If you wanted to move in here, I said, you could. The words arrived in the room and stayed there. Not dramatic, just present. The honest shape of something I had been aware of for a while, and had not said because there had always been something more immediately pressing, and then because saying it would make it real, and real things had weight. She did not answer immediately. She gave it the consideration it warranted, the same consideration she gave every significant thing, which was one of the reasons I had said it to her rather than keeping it in the category of things I thought about and did not say. I would need to think about that, she said finally, not reluctant, honest, measured in the way she was measured about everything that mattered. A pause. Then she turned her head slightly toward me. But first we need to get through tomorrow. Yeah, that part. Eden. Threehill. A community that had built its entire identity around not having any of this. Not the technology, not the off-world contact, not the weight of interstellar politics arriving on 3 shuttle vectors, whether they had invited it or not. Whatever the field held, and whoever was already there waiting for us to arrive, all of that, 12 hours out. One thing at a time. She settled, and I settled, and the drive maintained its steady presence through the ship's frame. Tomorrow was going to be what it was going to be. Tonight there was this, and this, I had learned, was not a small thing to have. 38. What we share. 12 hours out from Eden. Singapore moved in silence. Most of the crew was off duty, taking whatever rest was available before atmosphere, before the uncertainty resolved itself into something with edges and angles and people pointing weapons. The mess was nearly empty. Lights dimmed, chairs pushed in, the texture of conversation and movement absent in the way spaces feel absent when they have been full and aren't anymore. Gibby stood alone in the galley, methodically cleaning surfaces that did not particularly need it. Not because the work was required, because that was what you did before something important. Reset, prepare, and control the variables available to you when the larger ones were entirely out of reach. E stood near the bulkhead behind him, watching. As she often did, observing, building her picture of what these people were and how they operated. Your activity is not required at this time, she said. Gibby did not turn. Yeah, doesn't mean I stopped doing it. He wiped down the counter, slower now, the motion more meditative than functional. E tilted her head slightly. You engage in unnecessary tasks prior to high-risk operations. Wouldn't call it unnecessary. Helps clear the head. Gives the hands something to do while the brain works through things. A pause. E shifted her attention in the way she did when she was moving between observations she had been storing. I have been reviewing prior interactions, she said. That's so? Yes. The crew member designated Bishop was attempting to explain a cultural artifact to the crew member designated Varos. The content involved primitive humans interacting with advanced tools. The humor appeared to derive from the assumption that such interaction was inherently improbable. Gibby chuckled under his breath, turning to lean against the counter. Geico caveman commercials, early 21st century. He processed that. The humor appears inconsistent with known evolutionary history. Yeah, Gibby said. At the time those were made, nobody knew the Lennian existed. As far as humans understood it, Neanderthals were just gone, part of our past extinct, end of story. He gestured vaguely toward the corridor, toward the general direction of wherever Varos happened to be at that moment. Turns out they were relocated off-world before things went sideways on Earth. Which means, in hindsight, the joke lands a little differently than it was intended to. E considered this. Your species finds humor in inaccurate assumptions. Sometimes we find humor in ourselves. Depends on the day and how honest we're feeling. E shifted. I also observed the structured competitive interaction between crew members. Monopoly. Yes, the participants exhibited strategic behavior, resource accumulation, and territorial control across an extended period. Game's been ending friendships for generations. That's basically the point of it. This activity appears inefficient in terms of time and resource expenditure relative to outcome. Not wrong. He folded the cloth in his hands, more out of habit than practical need. But it's not really about winning. E tilted her head. Clarify. Gibby leaned back against the counter and looked at the empty tables for a moment. It's about being together, shared time, shared experience, going through something with the same people you're going to go through everything else with. He gestured toward the tables. Same reason we eat together even when we don't have to. E absorbed that. You utilize structured activities to reinforce social bonds. Yeah, that's a clean way to put it. Another pause settled. E remained still in the way she was still when she was working towards something she had not introduced yet. There is an additional behavior I have not been able to adequately interpret. Gibby exhaled quietly. All right, let's hear it. When the crew member designated Fevi requested to observe the mating behavior of the commanding officer and the medical officer, E began with the same measured tone she used for everything. The entire crew exhibited immediate and significant discomfort. This response appears inconsistent with the otherwise open quality of your social interactions. Gibby closed his eyes briefly. Yeah, figured that one was going to come up. E waited. He rubbed the back of his neck. Okay, that one's harder to explain than the caveman commercials. I am prepared to process a complex explanation. Gibby looked out at the empty mess and organized his thoughts. Humans are social. We share a lot. We eat together. We work together. We go through things together. That's real, and it matters. He paused. But some things we keep to ourselves. E's head tilted slightly. Define keep to ourselves. Private. Define private. Gibby let out a quiet breath. Things that belong only to the people involved. Things where the meaning comes from the fact that it isn't shared with everyone. Where the boundary itself is part of what makes it what it is. E processed that. Why? He did not answer immediately. He thought about it in a genuine way, not performing consideration, but actually working through it. Because it means more that way. Silence held the space for a moment. Meaning is increased by limiting observation, he said. Gibby gave a small, lopsided smile. Yeah, that's one way to put it. He folded the cloth again, the motion purely habitual now. It's not just biology either, it's trust. The people involved are choosing to be in that space together, and that choice means something. An audience changes what it is, makes it less. He absorbed that without immediate response. Then, humans restrict observation to preserve meaning. Yeah, we're kind of built that way. The private things matter more because they're private. That's not a bug, that's the whole point. The mess settled into quiet again. Outside the hull, Singapore continued its silent approach through a system that did not know it was coming. E remained where she was, standing near the bulkhead in the dimmed light, watching Gibby finish his methodical, unnecessary cleaning. But the quality of her watching had shifted slightly. Not the observation of behavior being catalogued, but something closer to the observation of behavior being understood. The data she was gathering had not changed in form, but what she was beginning to do with it had. Not just actions, reasons, the space between what people did and why they did it, the part that the hive mind had never needed to account for, because in a hive mind there was no space between. There was only the shared thing itself. Here the space was everything, and she was beginning to understand why. 39, 2 hours. 2 hours out from Eden, the Situation Room was full again. No empty chairs, no wasted motion, nobody pretending this was routine. The display showed the planet in slow rotation, blue water, green land, white cloud cover, peaceful from orbit. That was the lie planets always told from a distance. Up close they were never simple. Hernandez stood to my left with her arms folded and her expression set. Bishop was seated near the console with one hand resting against the table edge like she was already halfway back at the helm. Himura sat quietly with her tablet down for once, giving the room her full attention. Kimov held his position near the back wall with the stillness of someone who had decided stillness was its own form of readiness. Gibby was there too. Not because this was his battlefield, but because he was crew, and I was not going to exclude him from what came next. Varos and Fevai watched the tactical display with their respective versions of concentration, one mechanical and one scientific. E stood motionless and unreadable. Vrolksen positioned himself slightly apart from the rest, which somehow only made him more present. 8 from Singapore. 2 who were not exactly ours, but here regardless. I looked around the room and understood I was expected to say something. That was the persistent trouble with command. At some point, everyone turned and looked at you as though you were supposed to have the right words alongside the right plan, and those two things were not always the same thing. All right. That got the attention of the people who did not already have it, which was not many. In about 2 hours, we go planetside into a situation that's already unstable, and will probably get worse the moment we arrive. A couple of faces shifted fractionally. Nothing dramatic. Good, I did not need dramatic. I needed focused. We know Three Hill has an interest in Eden. We know the artifact matters and the cipher matters. And at this point, just about every significant player in this region of space has a stake in what happens next. I let that land before continuing. Humans, Lenians, Choldrons, Kalar, Miri, factions that don't agree on what day of the week it is are all watching this planet right now, whether the people living on it know it or not. The Concord Wardens have an interest. The Whisper Network has an interest. The Brown Dwarfs have an interest. Everybody wants to know what's buried in that field. and what happens on Eden is not staying on Eden. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. So here's the part I actually care about. Keep your head down. Don't take unnecessary risks. Give each other covering fire. Do the job you were trained to do and trust the person next to you to do the same. My eyes moved around the room. Kimov, Hernandez, Bishop. We move smart. We stay disciplined. We don't get sloppy because things get loud. My gaze found Himura for half a heartbeat and moved on before I held it too long. And we all come out of this in one piece. Good silence followed, the kind where people are listening rather than waiting for you to stop talking. Privately, I was hoping none of that had sounded too much like a speech. I was not built for speeches and never had been. Give me a tactical problem, incomplete information, and a map with too many unknowns, and I could work with that. Put me in front of my own crew and ask me to sound inspiring, and I felt like I was throwing deep in a crosswind. The mechanics were right, but the outcome was anybody's guess. Hernandez gave one short nod. Understood. That helped more than she probably knew. Bishop straightened slightly. I'll keep us invisible as long as I can. Do that. Kimov's answer was 3 words. We will be ready, which from him was essentially a guarantee. Favai inclined her head. I will prioritize cipher recovery and analysis. Good. Himura looked at me steadily. And I will prioritize the living. I gave her the smallest nod. I figured you might. That produced just enough of a shift in the room to remind me these people were still human, or close enough that the distinction did not matter for this purpose. Volkson spoke last from where he stood apart from the rest of us. Your crew understands the stakes, he said, in the measured tone he brought to everything. It was not exactly praise. Coming from him, it was close enough to count. E spoke after him, her translator rendering the words in its careful cadence. The outcome on Eden will alter multiple systems of trust. Yeah, that's one way to put it. I looked at the display one final time. Eden kept rotating, calm and entirely indifferent to what we were planning to do to its morning. Get your gear checked. Hydrate. Eat if you can. We launch on schedule. The room started to move. Chairs scraped softly. Tablets were picked up. People shifted back into roles and routines and whatever they did with the last 2 hours before things got dangerous. I stayed where I was for a moment longer and watched the planet turn. One peaceful world, one buried cipher, one rogue enemy who understood the stakes better than most, and far too many parties watching to see how it was resolved. I exhaled slowly and followed my crew out. 40. Descent. We broke from geosynchronous orbit right on schedule. There's always a moment when you commit to a descent where everything goes quiet, not outside, because space is always quiet, but inside your own head. No more planning, no more discussion, just execution. I had my hands on the controls of the bucket of bolts and felt the familiar vibration run through the frame as we adjusted attitude for the far side loop. Trajectory is within acceptable parameters, Varos said from behind me. That was his version of confidence. We'll take it. To my right, Himura had her medical case braced between her boots, one hand resting on it as if she could steady its contents by force of will. The case was unmistakable. White paneling, the winged staff with twin serpents across the front. Even on a combat insertion, she was exactly what she was, a healer, unambiguously, in every circumstance. Behind me, Kimov and 2 Marines sat locked in, green armor catching the dim cabin light. No conversation and no wasted movement, just readiness distilled into posture. Varos, in his Lenian armor, looked like he belonged to a different kind of conflict entirely. Sleeker lines, different geometry, built for a physiology that wasn't quite human but fought alongside us well enough that the distinction rarely mattered. I glanced back for half a second. Everybody strapped in. Kemov did not elaborate. "We are secure." "Good." Eden filled the forward display as we came around. Oceans giving way to landmass. Cloud cover thinning just enough to show terrain beneath. Green and quiet from up here. Beginning deceleration loop. The bucket of bolts rolled, nose angling to bleed velocity. A straight drop from orbit was not an option unless I wanted us to become a brief, bright event visible from the surface. So we ran the curve, letting gravity and vectoring scrub speed before we hit atmosphere. Varos shifted slightly. "I am still uncertain about the designation of this craft." "Yeah, you and me both. It does not inspire confidence. I've been flying it long enough that I stopped noticing. A beat. You decided to trust your life to it, so?" "I have, reluctantly." "That makes two of us." Himura gave me a look. "Pete, we'll get there, we always do." "Atmospheric interface in 10 seconds. Bishop's voice came through from orbit, calm as though she were reading off a weather report. "You're still clear." "Copy. See you on the other side." The countdown ran in my head whether I invited it or not. 3, 2, 1. We hit the atmosphere. The transition was never smooth. The bucket of bolts shuddered as the first layers of air grabbed the hull, converting vacuum silence into vibration and resistance. Heat built along the exterior, the forward view blooming with the faint glow of friction, the orange-white that looks peaceful from the outside and feels anything but from the inside. "Ride's about to get bumpy." It did. The whole craft rattled as we punched deeper, heating effects streaking past the display. For a second it reminded me of old Apollo footage, fire wrapping around the capsule, a controlled descent that looked entirely out of control to anyone watching from the outside. Anyone on the ground looking up right now would think we were a meteor. "Structural integrity holding," Varos said, with the tone of someone reading a grocery list. "Good to know." I fought the controls as the atmosphere thickened. The bucket of bolts bucked once, hard. Himura tightened her grip on the case. "That's normal?" "Define normal." "Peter, we're fine." I was already correcting the angle. "Attitude adjustment, nothing more." We leveled out below the worst of the heating, the glow fading, the shaking settling into something manageable. Clouds rushed past, then cleared, terrain coming into focus below, green fields, dirt roads, clustered structures that looked like they had grown out of the cliffside rather than been built on it. Eden, still peaceful from this altitude. For now. Final approach. Inland road, just like the plan. The other two shuttles were out there somewhere on their own vectors, looping in from north and south coastal approaches, 3 directions converging. Cut off movement, close in, control the ground before the ground controlled us. If everything went right, I brought us in low, skimming just above the terrain before settling onto the road with a controlled drop. The landing struts hit hard but held, dust and loose earth kicking up around the hull as we came to a stop. Engines wound down. Real silence settled over the cabin. Not the mechanical quiet of stealth, but the absence of everything we had been fighting against for the last several minutes. Touchdown. Nobody moved for a moment. Then the outside world started coming back in through the viewport. Villagers at a distance, staring. Some already backing away. Others frozen in place between curiosity and the older instinct that says unknown things falling from the sky are not usually good news. Can't blame them. "All right," I said, unstrapping. "Let's not make this worse than it has to be." Kemov and the Marines were already moving. Himura gathered her case. Varro stood and gave the interior one final evaluative look, as though he was still deciding whether the craft had been a sound choice. I cycled the hatch. It hissed open onto the air of Eden, cool, clean, carrying the faint smell of earth and vegetation, and something that reminded me of rain that had fallen recently. Different from the ship. Different from anywhere else we had been. We stepped out. The villagers shifted again, a ripple moving through them as we emerged. Most retreated further, keeping distance, eyes locked on us, the rational response given the circumstances. Except one. A teenager, mid to late teens, stepped forward while everyone around him stepped back. That alone told me something worth knowing. He stopped a few paces away and studied us with the expression of someone who had decided that curiosity outweighed fear, at least for the moment. Then he spoke. "My name is Isaac Thompson. No fear in it, just caution, and underneath the caution, something that looked a lot like the same curiosity I had seen in his expression." I glanced at Himura, then back at him. Peter Hansen, 41, the second son. Abraham did not explain his instructions, and David did not ask him to. That was the understanding between them, and had been for as long as David could remember. Abraham Thompson was not a man who gave directions without reason, and his sons had learned early that the reason would become apparent in the doing of the thing rather than in the asking about it. When Abraham said, "Go to the coast and find Sarah," David went to the coast to find Sarah. The road sloped away from the settlement's edge, packed earth giving way to grass, and then to the rougher, rockier ground that descended toward the sea. The air changed as he moved, the way coastal air changed, taking on weight and salt, and the rhythmic quality of waves breaking along the shoreline below, a sound that had been the background of his whole life, and that he normally stopped hearing the way you stopped hearing the sound of your own breathing. He heard it today. Everything was louder today. Not after what Isaac had described coming back from the village. Not after all of them had stood in the field and watched something cross the sky that none of them could accommodate. Not after his father's face in those first moments, which David had been studying his entire life, and had never seen quite that way before. He moved faster than the errand required. "Sarah!" The wind took his voice and carried it out over the scrubland, bringing nothing back. He stopped, listened, called again. Still nothing. He climbed the rise to get the full view of the coastline below, driftwood scattered across the sand, dark rocks cutting into the water where the tide worked back and forth, the sea stretching wide and gray and featureless beyond it all. No Sarah. That was not right. She always answered. She wandered constantly, had since she could walk, drawn to whatever was interesting with the gravity of a 10-year-old who had not learned to pretend things were not interesting, but she always answered when she heard her name. He had never called for her twice without a response. He moved faster down the slope. He heard it before he saw it, a sound that belonged to no category he had. Not an animal, not a tool, not any mechanical device in use in his community, something low and deliberate and growing louder with the quality of approach rather than passage, like it was going somewhere specific, and that somewhere was close. He turned toward it without deciding to, the instinct arriving ahead of the thought. The air above the coastal road did something he could not describe, a shimmer or a distortion, or a kind of wrongness in the way light behaved, and then something came through it. Descending fast and controlled, not falling but choosing where it would land, with a deliberateness that was the most alien thing about it before he had even registered what he was looking at. It hit the ground with force enough to travel through the earth, and up through the soles of his boots, kicking up a spray of coastal sand and dust that drifted sideways in the wind. David stopped, Every instinct he had produced the same clear instruction: run. The instinct was right, and he understood why. He stood exactly where he was, rooted by something that was not courage so much as the inability to stop watching something he had never seen and might never see again and had no explanation for. A hatch opened. 2 people stepped out. The first wore something that covered her completely, fitted close to the body, the color of deep water, smooth in a way that the materials of his world were never smooth. Not the roughness of wool or the grain of leather or even the finish of polished metal. Something else entirely, something that had been made with intention he could not read. Behind her came a second figure, broader, heavier, wearing green with a different design, carrying something his mind identified as a weapon before he could have explained why. But they were people. That was the thing that held him in place when the instinct said run. He could see it in the way they moved. 2 legs, 2 arms, upright. The weight distribution of human bodies in motion. The first one turned her head and looked directly at him, and the eyes that found his were human, and the face they were set in was human. A woman's face. Dark hair, angular features, and an expression of focused assessment that he had seen before on people who were trying to understand a situation faster than it was offering to be understood. They were people, carrying things he was not permitted to have, standing on ground his community had built its entire identity around keeping free of exactly what they represented. People who had come out of the sky in a machine that made no sound he had a name for. He took a step back. His feet did it without consulting him. The woman in blue spoke first. Her voice was controlled, clear, and entirely human in the way voices were human when they came from someone who had grown up speaking the same language you had grown up speaking. "My name is Claudia Hernandez. I'm from the Singapore." The name meant nothing to him, a word without a referent, a piece of a world he had no map to. But her voice was ordinary. That was the thing that let him find his own. He swallowed. "David Thompson, Abraham Thompson's son." He stopped, reorganized. "My father sent me down here." Hernandez tilted her head very slightly in the way people did when they were processing what had been said and deciding what to do with it. "What for?" "My sister. She's 10, Sarah. She comes down to the water sometimes when she wants to be alone. I can't find her." He looked past them toward the shoreline, toward the rocks and the break and the narrow strips of sand between them. "She should be here and she isn't, and she does not answer when I call." The sound of the wind and the surf filled the space between them for a moment. Behind Hernandez, the man in green armor was scanning the horizon in slow arcs, methodical, not anxious. The movement of someone doing a specific thing rather than reacting to uncertainty. Hernandez looked past David toward the coastline. He could see her running some calculation, not hesitating, just moving through a decision faster than she was showing it. It took only a few seconds. It won't stay clear out there. Not with what's coming in. He stepped forward before he had consciously decided to, the urgency arriving in his body before his mind caught up with it. "Then we need to find her." Hernandez nodded once, clean and decided. "Agreed." She turned briefly toward the man in green. "Change of plan. We go to the shoreline first." Not a suggestion, not a request for input. A statement of what was happening next. Then she moved past David and started down the slope toward the sea without waiting to see if anyone was following. He followed immediately. Of course he did. The slope down to the shore was uneven, the grass giving way to bare rock, then to damp, compact sand near the waterline. The sound of the waves grew as they descended, filling in around them. The man in green tracked just behind David and to his right, scanning the terrain with the steady attention of someone whose job was to make sure nothing arrived unexpectedly. David found himself looking sideways at Hernandez's armor as they moved. The texture of it up close was unlike anything he could compare to. Not hard like metal, not soft like cloth, something that seemed to exist in a category between, responding to her movement with her rather than against it. There were no seams he could identify, no joins, no rivets, no evidence of how it had been made. He looked away before she could notice him looking. "What are you?" The words came out before he had finished deciding to say them. The question he had been holding since the hatch opened. The one that was more honest than anything polite he might have substituted for it. She did not answer immediately. They were moving down the last section of slope, the shoreline opening up in front of them, the full spread of the coastline visible now, the break where the waves came in over the rocks, the darker sand beyond it, the sections of tide pool cut into the rock faced to the north. "We're here to help," she said finally. It was not much of an answer. It was the kind of answer that communicated the question was being heard, and that the full response would take longer than they had right now. He accepted it and turned his attention back to the shoreline. "Sarah?" He put his full voice into it this time, letting it carry over the sound of the waves, directing it toward the rocks where she would be most likely to be found, studying something she had found. "Sarah?" The sea answered him with nothing. The rocks gave nothing back. The wind moved across the surface of the water, and the water moved as it always had, indifferent and constant. Then movement. Near the break, low against the dark rock face, the quick, unmistakable motion of someone small who had been absorbed in something, and was only now registering that the world beyond that thing existed, and contained her name being called with some urgency. David's chest compressed with relief, and something adjacent to frustration that he did not have time to feel yet. There, down by the break, against the rocks. Hernandez was already moving, her stride lengthening into something faster, the man in green accelerating alongside her with the fluid economy of someone for whom speed and control were not in conflict. "Go!" They ran toward the rocks together. David and Claudia Hernandez, who had come out of a machine from the sky and had a name he did not know the meaning of, running across the sand of his community's coastline toward his 10-year-old sister, who had no idea what was happening above her on the cliff top, or what was bearing down on all of them from whatever was coming next. He did not know it fully either, but he ran. 42 orbital silence. Lieutenant Amanda Bishop did not sit in the captain's chair. She could have. Hernandez had made that explicit before going planetside, half practical instruction, half a quiet challenge to see what Bishop would do with it. Bishop had already decided before the offer was fully made. The chair sat behind her, empty and untouched, while she remained at the helm, hands resting lightly on the joystick and throttle, her eyes fixed forward. If something went wrong up here, it was not going to be because she had handed control to someone else at the moment it mattered. Control meant inputs. Inputs meant survival. She understood that equation to the point where she did not have to think about it anymore. The bridge felt larger than usual with most of the crew planetside. 2 ensigns remained, one at Viros's engineering station, one at the science console where Favi normally worked. Both were quiet, focused, and visibly aware of the weight that came with being the only people on a bridge that was supposed to have more of them. Through the open channel from the Situation Room, Gibby's voice carried faintly. He was talking, he was almost always talking, and Bishop did not need to hear the specific words to understand what he was doing. Explaining the human condition to E, probably. In the patient and practical way, he explained everything, while E processed, categorized, and built her picture of what humans were. Bishop allowed herself the faintest suggestion of a smirk. Good luck with that project. She had a hard enough time explaining humanity to other humans. Better to stay with what made sense. QWERTY keyboards, flight inputs, vectoring, reaction time, systems that behave the same way every time you ask them to. Joystick and throttle. Glass cockpit logic that would have been recognizable to pilots from a century ago. Simple, predictable, reliable. The same conservatism of design that had carried through every generation of human aviation, because the cost of deviation was always higher than the benefit. Skipper. The ensign at the science console broke the silence without urgency, which Bishop had already learned meant the news was significant, but not immediately catastrophic. She did not turn. Go ahead. Incoming ping. Ship just dropped out of FTL. Keylar signature. Estimated 90 minutes out. Bishop's grip on the throttle tightened by a fraction. There it was. She leaned forward slightly as the data populated across the forward display, refining itself as the passive sensors pulled in more detail. 90 minutes. Confirmed. She ran through the variables quickly and methodically. Ground teams deployed, communications limited by operational security, stealth profile still holding. Nobody dropped out of FTL inside a planetary gravity well, unless they wanted to scatter themselves across the surface. Entry vectors were always calculated, always above or below the orbital plane where gravitational shear could not touch you, which meant the Keylar ship was coming in clean, measured, deliberate, and still far enough out that she had options. She considered breaking radio silence, a brief burst to Hansen, enough to give him the warning and let him adjust. Her eyes moved to the surface tracking overlay. Multiple friendlies in unsecured positions. Communications already carrying risk. Hostile situation on the ground still developing. She exhaled slowly and made the call. No? If the Keller were here, Hansen would know soon enough through his own channels, or through what happened next. Breaking stealth early would not give him anything he could use. It would just make Singapore visible, and once she was visible, she became a target, and Bishop was not ready to be a target yet. Maintain stealth profile, no active transmissions, passive sensors only. Aye, Skipper. The engineering ensign's voice was tight but controlled. Good enough. Bishop made a fractional adjustment to their position, barely perceptible, just enough to shift their angle relative to the planet's rotation and put them off any predictable pattern. The kind of movement that kept them hidden, not through technology alone, but through unpredictability. Cat and mouse. She had always preferred being the cat. The forward display updated again, refining the Keylar ship's projected trajectory. It would arc slowly and deliberately toward the planet, positioning for whatever came next. Interdiction, observation, or something that would require her to stop being patient about the weapons console. Her thumb brushed the edge of the weapons control without activating anything. Not yet. Timing mattered more than anything else up here, and she knew it. From the situation room, Gibby's voice drifted through again. I'm just saying it's complicated. Humans don't always make sense, even to ourselves. Bishop shook her head slightly, eyes already back on the display. Understatement of the decade. Keep tracking. Updates every 5 minutes. Yes, ma'am. She eased back just enough to release the tension in her shoulders without releasing the controls. The Keylar ship was still distant, but the distance was closing at a rate that made 90 minutes feel considerably shorter than it sounded. The captain's chair behind her remained exactly where it was. Empty, untouched, and going to stay that way. All right, Bishop said quietly to the display, to herself, to the empty space between Singapore and whatever was coming toward them. You don't have to win. Her fingers settled more firmly on the throttle as she made another subtle course adjustment. keeping them just outside any predictable alignment. Just make them work for it. The hunt had started. She intended to stay invisible until the precise moment she decided otherwise. 43. The third son. Joseph did not mind the walk to the Wilson orchard. It gave him time to think, which was something the house rarely offered. Too many voices, too many expectations, too many ways things were supposed to be done before they were done any other way. One of his mothers had asked him to go, not ordered, asked, which meant something in a household where the distinction was understood. See if Elijah had apples left. They'd make pies tonight. That part Joseph liked without reservation. He had always had a comfortable understanding with Elijah Wilson. They traded when it made sense, helped each other when it cost something. Elijah had taken over most of the orchard work after his father fell ill, and Joseph respected that without needing to say so. Running something that size alone was not a small thing. The path joined the road at the edge of the Wilson orchard, the rows of trees coming into view alongside it, orderly, deliberate, the kind of shape that took years to produce and longer to maintain. Joseph adjusted the sack on his shoulder and kept moving. He was on the road just past the orchard's outer rows when the sound reached him. Low, mechanical, carrying the quality of something that was operating rather than existing, alive in a functional sense without being alive in any way he had a category for. He stopped and turned slowly, eyes moving across the sky. Then he saw it. Something moving with impossible certainty, cutting through the air on a controlled descent. Not falling, but choosing its landing point with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental about it. It touched down not far from him, dust and loose earth lifting around the hull. A machine. It had to be. But not one any community on Eden was permitted to have or use or bring onto this ground. Joseph did not move. In the distance, the other people who had been on the road were already creating space between themselves and whatever had arrived, hesitating, watching, backing away by degrees. Joseph tracked them briefly, then turned back toward the machine. He did not follow. Curiosity had gotten him into trouble before. He had never entirely stopped finding it worth it. The hatch opened. 2 figures stepped out. They were not what he expected. He was not sure what he had expected, but it was not this. The first was smaller, lighter, moving with a precision he could not quite categorize. Something in the economy of each motion, nothing wasted, everything intentional. The second stood taller and broader, carrying something that occupied the uncertain ground between tool and weapon. It was the smaller one that held his attention. She did not look entirely human, or did not look human in the way everyone Joseph had ever met looked human. The proportions were slightly different, the movement was slightly different, and something about the way she tracked everything in her immediate environment simultaneously reminded him, strangely, of the small burrowing animals that turned up in the fields, quick, aware, missing nothing. Joseph took a step forward before the thought was complete. Everyone else was keeping their distance. He was not. She turned toward him. When she spoke, her voice was precise in a way that went beyond accent or manner, each word placed exactly where it needed to be, nothing included that did not need to be there. State your purpose. Joseph swallowed. Then he answered the question he had actually been carrying since the moment the machine touched down. Are you here about the thing we found in the field? She did not hesitate. Yes. A brief pause. Have you seen it? I was there when the plow struck it. The memory arrived cleanly, metal hitting something that was not stone, the jolt through the handles, the sound that had no name for him. I almost touched it, but my father told me to stop. So he had. Because that was what you did when your father told you to stop. And because some part of him had understood even then that this was the kind of thing you did not touch without knowing more than you did. She studied him for a moment with the steady, unblinking attention of someone cataloging rather than judging. "My name is Favai." Joseph nodded once. "Joseph Thompson." Names mattered. He had been taught that and believed it independently of the teaching. Favai inclined her head slightly, a small, precise motion that suggested the information had been received and filed for later use, rather than offered as social currency. "Can you show me where it is?" No demand in it. Just purpose, direct and clean. Joseph looked past her toward the road, toward the fields beyond where the object still lay in the earth, partly uncovered now, partly not, waiting with the patience of something that had already waited longer than any of them could calculate. He thought about his father, about what Isaac would say, about David, who was probably already doing something useful somewhere else entirely. Then he looked back at Favai. Yes. He paused because the thought arrived and would not be set aside. "You're not from here." It was not quite a question. She did not answer it. Instead, she shifted slightly, creating space beside him rather than in front of him. "Lead the way." Joseph adjusted the sack on his shoulder and turned toward the fields, without checking whether she followed. He already knew she would. For the first time since the plow had struck something it should not have, he felt something settle into the space that uncertainty had been occupying. Not answers, just the direction toward them. Whatever they had found in that field, it was not finished with the Thompson family yet, and Joseph, for his part, was no longer sure he wanted it to be. 44. The Fang. Three-Hill stood on the elevated dais above the command deck, positioned just high enough to look down on every station in the room. It was intentional. Perspective mattered, and he had never been casual about the kind of perspective he maintained. Below him, crew moved with disciplined efficiency, data flowing across displays, sensor returns updating in real time, weapons systems cycling through readiness checks. The command room of the Fang had been built for control, awareness, and dominance, and from where he stood it functioned exactly as designed. His gaze settled on the forward display. Eden. A quiet world? A mistake, in the way that all quiet things were mistakes when they sat on top of something that mattered. He did not know yet whether Hansen had arrived. That uncertainty did not trouble him. What troubled him was what Hansen represented, not as an individual officer, but as a precedent. If Hansen became a Concord warden, he would not simply be another human in an influential position. He would become the standard, the reference point. When other species thought of humanity, they would think of him first. Three-Hill's jaw tightened fractionally. Humanity had expanded too far, too quickly. They moved into systems they did not fully understand, inserted themselves into conflicts they had not earned the standing to influence, and built alliances with a speed that read as confidence from the outside. Three-Hill saw it for what it actually was: instability dressed in ambition. Unchecked growth always collapsed eventually. The only variable was how much it took down with it when it did. His thoughts broke as a voice rose from below. "Commander, we have exited FTL." Three-Hill shifted his attention to the officer. "Report. Current position places us approximately 90 minutes from Eden at sublight approach. All systems nominal." He stepped forward slightly, hands clasped behind his back. "Sensor sweep?" The officer hesitated by a fraction. "No visible contacts, no active ships in orbit or near the surface." No visible ships. The distinction was the point. Singapore was stealth-capable, and he had already accounted for that. He would not be surprised by the same variable twice. Maintain passive scanning. Increase resolution on anomalous returns. Anything that doesn't belong gets identified immediately. "Yes, Commander?" He returned his attention to the display as Eden continued its slow rotation. the surface calm and almost inviting, like things were before something disrupted them. He had thoroughly reviewed the settlement data. A human community that had chosen to abandon advanced technology, a deliberate, principled rejection of everything their broader civilization had built. He did not understand it. In his world, there had been no such choice available to make. The Keller had been born under the crushing gravitational influence of a gas giant's proximity, their civilization forced upward against physics that did not negotiate. Spaceflight had not been philosophical. It had been survival. Every advancement earned through failure, every step paid for in concrete loss. There was no inherited shortcut, no found technology to compress centuries of development into decades. Just the long, grinding work of a species refusing to be contained by the world it had been given. Humans had faced none of that. Like the Lenians, they had been given advantages they had not manufactured. A stable world with a large moon, a natural destination, somewhere to go before they were capable of going anywhere else. And when they reached it, they found more. A crashed vessel. Technology that was not theirs, that they had not developed, that they had reverse-engineered with the confidence of people who had never had to earn every tool they had ever used. A shortcut, an acceleration point. And now they spread that acceleration outward, system by system. It would not end well. It never did. "Prepare for approach," Thrahill said. "Maintain current vector." "Yes, Commander." He allowed his thinking to move past the immediate, toward Hansen specifically. The intelligence reports had been thorough. Hansen had infiltrated a secured installation, recovered the Myri male under fire, and then returned him, not leveraged him, not used him as a negotiating instrument, not extracted value from the situation before making the ethical gesture, just returned him, without conditions. Thrahill understood that kind of decision. He had encountered it before in officers worth taking seriously. It was not weakness. It was something adjacent to weakness in its effects, without sharing weakness's source. A genuine need for actions to align with an internal measure of what was right. Admirable in the abstract. Predictable in practice. And predictability had uses. Hansen would prioritize protection. He would hesitate where others would not. He would choose the lives immediately in front of him over the larger strategic outcome, because that was how people who operated on internal moral frameworks made decisions under pressure. It was not a flaw in his character. It was a point of entry in his decision-making. "I want full surface mapping of the settlement areas, population clusters, movement patterns. Identify all non-combatant concentrations." The tactical officer looked up. "Yes, Commander." Thrahill kept his eyes on the display. If Hansen was already on the ground, he would act as expected, protect, prioritize, put the people in front of him before the outcome behind them. And when that moment arrived, when the choice between the immediate and the consequential forced itself into the space where decisions got made, Thrahill would be positioned to use it. 90 minutes, the officer confirmed quietly. Thrahill inclined his head slightly. "Then we proceed." Below him, the command deck moved with renewed focus. Above it, Eden kept turning, unaware, unprepared, and sitting directly in the path of what was 90 minutes away in closing. 45, the Patriarch. "My father will want to meet you," Isaac said, as if it were already settled rather than a question. I believed him. "Where is he?" "Center of town." "Lead the way." I turned slightly. "Kimov." He stepped in immediately, and the two Marines shifted with him, the way they did when they were operating as a single system. "Spread out," I said quietly. "Find choke points, roads, elevation, anything someone could use to approach unseen. Keep it low profile. These people scare easily." He did not ask why. He never did when the reasoning was obvious. Yes, Captain, we will secure the perimeter. Then he moved off with the Marines, peeling into the edges of the settlement with the practiced ease of people who belonged nowhere in particular and used that to their advantage. I turned back to Isaac. Let's go. Himura fell in at my right. Varos moved just behind us, silent and observant. I did not need to look at him to know he was cataloging everything. The layout, the construction materials, the patterns of movement, and the structural logic of a settlement built without any of the tools he would have used. The town was not large. Wood and stone, simple lines, no visible technology beyond what hands and basic tools could produce. No infrastructure that connected to anything outside itself. They had chosen this, all of it deliberately, as a community. That thought stayed with me as we walked. People watched from doorways and along the road. Some stepped back. Others held their ground but kept a distance, eyes tracking every movement we made. Nobody approached, nobody spoke. We were the disruption, and they knew it without being told. Isaac led us into an open space near the center, larger than the surrounding areas, clearly left that way intentionally. A place for gathering, for decisions, for the kind of community business that required everyone to see each other. A man stood there waiting. Older, solid, with the kind of presence that did not need announcement or positioning. He had already seen us coming from a distance and had chosen to be ready. "That's him," Isaac said. I did not need the confirmation. He stepped forward as we approached, taking in everything. Me, Himura. Varos, the armor and gear, with the steady, measuring gaze of someone accustomed to making assessments quickly and trusting them. Abraham Thompson. Peter Hansen. We stopped a few feet apart. He did not offer a hand. I did not expect one. "I am told you came from the sky." That's one way to put it. His expression did not shift. "I am also told you have not harmed anyone. Not planning to start." A pause. Then he nodded once, the motion precise and deliberate. "I am still looking for two of my sons, Joseph and David." I let that sit for a moment. Isaac, Joseph, David, Abraham. I kept that observation to myself. "We've got teams already out," I said. "We'll help find them." That registered, not relief exactly, but something in the vicinity of acknowledgement. Then I noticed the woman standing behind him, holding a baby. The child was crying in the strained way that was not ordinary fussing. Something was wrong in it, something with an edge. Himura had already noticed. She stepped forward slightly, her voice kept soft. "Your baby has a fever. Let me help." The woman Hannah I had heard pulled the child closer instinctively, stepping back. "No, we will manage." Abraham's posture shifted, protective and wary simultaneously. Isaac spoke before it could harden into something worse. "They have not hurt me. They could have." Hannah looked between them while the baby kept crying. Himura had not moved any closer, had not reached for her case. She just raised her hand slightly, open, the most non-threatening gesture available to someone in her situation. "May I?" she asked. Nothing added to it, just the question. Hannah hesitated, then slowly she nodded. Himura moved in carefully, the way you approach something fragile that deserves caution. Instead of going straight for the scanner, she placed the back of her hand gently against the baby's forehead. Simple, immediate, human. She held it there without rushing. Then she looked up. "She's running hot." Hannah's expression shifted, fear and confirmation arriving together, and underneath both of them something close to relief that what she'd been feeling was not wrong. "I have tools that can help," Himura said, "but I will need to use them." Abraham stepped forward. "We do not use such things." Himura met his gaze without backing away from it. "I understand, but your child is sick." The baby cried again, this time weaker. Hannah looked down at her daughter, then at Himura. Do it? Abraham did not agree. He did not stop her either. That was enough. Himura opened her case with measured, deliberate movements, just enough to reach what she needed. The scanner came out first, small and compact. She ran it over the baby with minimal ceremony, the device emitting a barely audible tone. It's an infection. I watched Abraham's jaw tighten at the word, even though I was not sure he fully understood the specific meaning. Himura reached back for the jet injector. Compact, no needle, nothing that looked like what Hannah was probably imagining. I'm going to give her an antibiotic and something to support her system, and vitamin support to help her recover. It won't hurt her? Hannah asked. She may react for a moment. It will pass. Hannah braced slightly, holding the baby closer. Himura positioned the injector against the baby's arm with practiced steadiness. All right, she murmured. A soft click. The baby cried out sharply, then settled, the intensity already beginning to fall away. Himura withdrew the device and stepped back, giving Hannah room. It won't clear immediately. Give it a few hours. Hannah looked down at her daughter, breathing unevenly. The baby's crying had softened, less urgent, more like it was supposed to be. The silence that followed was not fear. Not anymore. Something else had moved in, uncertainty, and underneath it, something that might have been hope finding its footing. Abraham looked from Himura to me. You bring things we have chosen to live without. I did not argue the point. We just use them differently. Not the whole truth, but enough for now. Isaac stood off to the side watching all of it, and I understood from his face that whatever conclusion he had already begun forming about us had just moved further in one direction. Somewhere out there, Joseph. David, still unaccounted for. I looked back at Abraham. We'll find your sons. This time it was not something to say. It was a promise, and I meant it. 46 response. The walk back to the field felt shorter than Joseph remembered. Maybe because he was not making it alone this time. He could feel Fevai behind him without looking, her presence quiet and precise, measuring every step, sound, and movement of the world around her with the focused attention she brought to everything. Rolkson maintained his distance behind them both, but Joseph was aware of him in the way you are aware of something watching without being watched back. The field came into view. Rows of turned earth stretched ahead, the soil still disturbed where the plow had struck something it should not have. Even from a distance, the unnatural line breaking through the ground was visible, the boundary between ordinary and not. Joseph slowed. That's it, he pointed. Right there. Fevai moved past him without responding, approaching the exposed object with careful, deliberate steps, her attention narrowing to the object in the soil. Joseph followed and stopped just short of the broken earth. Up close, the object looked stranger than he remembered. Not metal, not stone, something occupying the territory between them, smooth in places and textured in others, shaped with obvious purpose by hands or processes he had no framework for. It doesn't belong here, he said quietly. Fevai crouched beside it. No, it does not. She extended one hand and held it there for a moment without making contact. Then she produced a device from a compartment along her side. Small, compact, angular, nothing Joseph could have named. He leaned forward. What is that? A scanner. She did not look up. It will allow me to gather data on the object. Joseph nodded, understanding the words without fully understanding what they meant in practice. Fevai activated the device. A faint tone sounded, barely audible, and a soft shifting light moved across the object's surface as she swept the scanner in slow, controlled arcs. Every pass was deliberate, following a pattern only visible to her, methodical in a way that suggested she was looking for something specific, rather than simply looking. "It appears inert," she said after a moment. Joseph frowned. "Inert? No active energy output, no observable function." He looked back at the object. It did not feel inert. He could not have explained why, but the feeling was there regardless, the sense that something was present in a way that had nothing to do with what was visible. He took a step closer. "Be cautious," Fevai said, tone unchanged. Joseph hesitated. Then, before the hesitation could complete itself into restraint, he reached out and let his fingers brush the surface. For a fraction of a second, nothing. Then light, not like fire, not like lanterns, not like anything he had a name for. It did not shine outward so much as from within, lines and patterns forming beneath the surface and moving through it, shifting, alive in a way that made no sense in any category he possessed. He pulled his hand back sharply. Fevai was already moving. It responded. Something had sharpened in her voice, not alarm, but a focused intensity that had not been there before. She swept the scanner over the object again, faster this time, more precise. The patterns continued moving faintly beneath the surface, fading but not disappearing, like something settling back toward stillness without quite reaching it. Joseph looked at his hand. "I didn't do anything." Fevai redirected the scanner toward him. "Remain still." He blinked. "What?" "Remain still," repeated with the same calm certainty. He froze. The device passed over him, the same faint tone, the same shifting light, but directed at him now rather than the object. Then back to the object. Then to him again. Her movements grew tighter and more focused, comparison rather than exploration. "What is it?" Joseph asked. Fevai lowered the scanner slightly. "It is responding to you." He shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "No." She agreed with the candor of someone who meant it rather than offering comfort. "It does not." She ran the sequence again. Scanner to him, scanner to the object, the same careful comparison, and her head tilted slightly in the way it did when she was processing something that required more than observation. "It is reacting to your biological structure, specifically to your genetic pattern." Joseph stared at her. "My what?" "Your DNA." The word meant nothing to him, but the weight she gave it meant something. The weight of information that changes the shape of a situation rather than adding to it. He looked back at the object. The patterns were barely visible now. Faint as embers well after a fire has passed, but present. "Why?" he asked. Fevai did not answer immediately. She moved closer to the object, the scanner hovering just above its surface without touching. "I do not know." Something was different in her voice. Not uncertainty exactly. Fevai did not carry uncertainty the way most people did, but something adjacent to it. The quality of a mind that has encountered something that does not resolve into existing understanding. Joseph looked at his hand again. The place where he had made contact had felt warm when it happened. Not heat, not the warning sensation of something dangerous, something more deliberate than that, aware. "What does it mean?" he asked. Fevai straightened slowly. "It means this object is not inactive." A pause. It was waiting. "For what?" She looked at him directly, in the way she rarely looked at anything. Not cataloging, not assessing, but delivering something she understood he needed to receive clearly. "For you." The wind moved across the field, carrying turned earth and something else underneath it that Joseph could not name. He stepped back without deciding to. The object lay between them, quiet again. Patterns faded. Surface still, but not the same as it had been before he touched it. Not the same as anything anymore. 47 contacts. The quiet was the wrong kind. Not the quiet of things running the way they were supposed to, the other kind. The kind that settled over a situation when something was lining up just outside your field of vision, positioning itself while your attention was directed somewhere else. The kind you learn to recognize after enough operations, the way you learn to recognize the quality of air before a storm. Not what you could see, what you could feel assembling. I was standing with Abraham in the center of the village, watching the relief coordinator work. Himura had set up her triage point exactly where I had asked. It was already doing what it needed to do. People flowing toward it with varying degrees of injury and shock, and the disorientation of people whose world had just changed shape. The baby's crying had quieted, which was its own small relief. Abraham was watching his community adapt to the presence of things it had deliberately chosen never to have, with the expression of a man who understood that some decisions could not be unmade and was figuring out how to live with that. Then my comm clicked, and everything shifted registers. Hansen, Hernandez. Her voice was tight and controlled, which was her baseline under pressure, not stressed, just compressed, every word earning its place. 2 contacts at the shoreline, male, 13, female, approximately 10 years old. David and Sarah, both of them. I exhaled one long, controlled breath. Status? Alive and mobile. The girl was down by the rock. She didn't know what was happening up here. Area around them is clear right now, but that assessment has a short shelf life given what's inbound. Bring them in. Center of the village. We consolidate everyone we've got here. Copy. Moving now. ET approximately 8 minutes on foot. Keep your head down on the way in. The perimeter is not clean. Understood. The line closed. Abraham had not caught the words. My comm was set to earpiece, and he had been looking at the triage area rather than at me, but he had registered the change in my posture, the way people who paid close attention to the people around them registered things. He looked at me with the steady, measuring attention that seemed to be a family trait. One of them? Both. Hernandez has them. They're coming in now. Something shifted in him. Not relief exactly, not the visible exhale of a man who had been holding his breath, more like the adjustment of a structure that had been under tension and had found one of its load-bearing points was going to hold. He did not relax. He recalibrated. Good. I was already moving to the next problem. 3 sons, 3 locations. Isaac was here in the village with us. David and Sarah were inbound with Hernandez. That left the 3rd. Favai. Status report. A pause, not a signal delay, a different quality. The pause of someone choosing what to lead with. I am in the field with Joseph. We have located the cipher artifact. It is not in an inert state. I stopped moving. Define not inert. It responded. To Joseph. He made physical contact with the surface, and the object activated. Light patterns across the surface, geometric configurations resolving and reforming. It is reacting to something specific about his genetic structure. I stood still for a full second and let that land completely before responding. Say that again. Exactly. The artifact is responding to Joseph's biological signature. Fivai repeated it with the measured patience she used when information was difficult, but accuracy was non-negotiable. Specifically, a Lennian-equivalent genetic markers present in his DNA at approximately 1% expression. I have run the scan 3 times. The result is consistent. I do not yet understand the mechanism or the origin of the marker. Behind me, Abraham's voice arrived with the controlled anger that comes from fear that has been sitting long enough to harden into something with edges. I told him not to touch it. He said it quietly, directed at no one specifically. I told him the morning we found it. Leave it alone until we understand what it is. I looked back at him. They don't always listen to the right instructions at the right time. I turned back to the calm. Fevi. No further contact between Joseph and the object until we have a better picture of what's happening. Keep distance between them. Understood. Though I should note that the object continued its response pattern after he stepped back. The activation did not require sustained contact. Whatever it triggered, it is ongoing. Of course it was. Varos. I looked at him. He was already reading the situation, already understanding what was coming before I said it. Get to the field. Assist Fevi. An object that responds to Lennian genetic markers needs Lennian eyes on it. That's potentially the most important assessment we're going to get. He did not ask for elaboration. Understood. He was already moving, steady and deliberate, crossing the open square and heading toward the field path without looking back. Varos operated best when the task was clear, and the doing of it was up to him. I stood for a moment and let the full picture assemble itself. David and Sarah inbound with Hernandez, 8 minutes out. Joseph in the field with Fevi, and a now active alien artifact responding to something in his biology that should not exist in a 13-year-old farmer from an isolationist community on an independent world. Varos, en route to provide whatever engineering perspective a Lennian who maintained an FTL drive could offer on alien technology that appeared to recognize Lennian DNA. Kimov holding the perimeter with 2 Marines against a mercenary force whose internal composition and reliability were still being determined. Abraham, standing 3 feet away, processing the simultaneous information that his community was under attack. 2 of his children were safe, and 1 of his children had apparently just lit up an alien artifact by touching it. The situation had more moving parts than I was comfortable tracking simultaneously. That was fine. That was most situations. Then Bishop to Hansen. I took exactly 1 second before responding. Go ahead. We've got company. Her tone was the one she used when the news was significant, and she had already spent the time to be certain before delivering it. The Fang just dropped out of FTL on the far side of the planet. Signature is clean and consistent with what we've got on file. It's them. Of course it was. The timing was exactly what it should have been if Three-Heel had been running a parallel approach. Let the brown dwarfs establish the ground situation, arrive with his own ship once the extraction was in progress, provide orbital support and a clean exit vector. The operation had been planned in layers, and we were watching the final layer arrive. I'm breaking radio silence under line of sight cover. Bishop's voice was flat and professional, the tone of someone who had already assessed the risk and made the call and was now reporting the decision rather than asking permission for it. Their current position puts them behind the planet's limb relative to our orbital track. They can't see us yet, but their approach vector suggests they're going to move to a lower orbit to support the ground operation, and when they do that, the geometry changes. How much time before they have line of sight on our position? Depends on what orbit they settle into. If they go low for ground support, 20 minutes, maybe less. If they hold high for control of the orbital plane, longer, but we lose our concealment advantage when they start active scanning sweeps. I looked out across the village square. People moving between the triage area and the shelter clusters, following directions, doing what people did when they were in the middle of something they did not understand and someone with apparent authority was pointing them somewhere. None of them had any framework for the fact that a warship had just arrived in orbit above them and was positioning to support the people who were shooting at their community. If they deploy from low orbit, Bishop said, insertion time for whatever they're sending down is significantly compressed. Less velocity to bleed off, faster approach, less warning for anyone on the ground. They're going to hit whatever's already happening hard and fast. Yes, sir. That's the read. Keep eyes on them. Don't activate anything that gives away our position unless you're out of alternatives. I'm running a full passive suite. They'll have to be actively looking for something my size and stealth profile to find us, and right now they've got other things to look at. I'll stay quiet as long as staying quiet is the right call. The moment that changes, you'll know before I finish the sentence. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Good. The line held open for one more beat, then closed. I lowered my hand and stood with the assembled picture. Hernandez inbound with 2 of Abraham's children. Favai in the field with a 13-year-old whose touch had activated alien technology for reasons nobody yet understood. Varos moving to assess that technology from the perspective of someone whose species apparently shared something with it. Kimov managing a perimeter against a force that had fractured along species lines, either as a tactical opportunity or a precursor to something worse. Bishop in orbit, watching a Kalar warship find its position while keeping Singapore invisible against the void. And Thriel, somewhere in that orbital geometry, aboard that ship, lining up whatever came next in a sequence he had planned and I was reacting to. I looked at Abraham Thompson. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were steady in the way of someone who had made peace with the fact that the situation was larger than his ability to control it, and was now focused on the smaller set of things he could actually affect. "They're coming." I did not specify who. He already understood enough about the shape of what was moving toward his community that the specific details would not change what he needed to do. He nodded once. "What do you need from me?" That question, from a man who had every reason to be focused entirely on his own people, asked in the context of what he could do for the situation rather than what the situation was doing to him, told me something about Abraham Thompson that nothing else in our interaction had managed as efficiently. Keep your people calm, keep them together, keep them away from the field perimeter. I looked at him steadily. Whatever happens in the next hour, the safest place for everyone in this community is exactly where they are right now. He held my gaze. "And my son?" "Favai is with him, and Varos will be there in 3 minutes. Nobody is going to let anything happen to Joseph." I believed that when I said it. I just was not entirely certain the universe was going to cooperate. The wind moved through the village, carrying voices, and the distant, diminishing sound of a child's crying that had been fading since Himura administered the antibiotic hours ago. The baby was going to be fine. That was one thing that had gone right, and I was going to hold on to it. I took a slow breath and turned toward the field. Time to deal with what was coming. 48. Threshold. Varos saw the field before he saw them. Disturbed soil cut across the land in a clean, unnatural line, mechanical force applied where it didn't belong. Human agriculture, working ground that had resisted it. He moved through without comment. 2 figures stood near the break in the earth. Favai, the boy, and between them, the object. Even at distance, Varos could see it was inconsistent with any fabrication method he recognized. Its surface geometry shifted with perspective, angles resolving and unresolving as though the structure resisted straightforward interpretation. He slowed as he approached. "Status." Favai did not look away from the object. "I've conducted additional scans. The response is consistent." Joseph stood a short distance back, watching them and the object with the wary attention of someone who had understood enough to know something was wrong without understanding enough to know what. Varos stepped closer to the exposed surface. "Define consistent." Favai turned slightly toward him. "The subject exhibits a genetic anomaly, approximately 1% Lennian equivalent markers." Varos paused. 1%. "Yes." He looked at Joseph. Nothing outwardly remarkable. Human morphology, human behavior, no visible indicators of divergence from baseline. And yet the object had responded to his touch and to nothing else. He turned back to the structure. That level of expression should be non-functional. That was my assessment. Joseph shifted his weight. You both keep saying things like that and then not explaining them. Varos did not address it. He stepped to the edge of the structure and considered the problem from the only angle that would resolve it quickly. If the object's response was based on Lennian genetic recognition, it should respond to him at significantly higher magnitude than it had to Joseph. He extended his hand and made contact. Nothing. No light, no pattern, no reaction. The surface remained inert beneath his touch. He withdrew his hand slowly. Confirmed, no interaction. Fevai's head tilted. That suggests the response is not based on the quantity of genetic expression. Correct. Joseph looked between them. So what does that mean? Varos worked through it. If not quantity, then structure. The specific arrangement of markers, rather than their concentration. He arrived at the conclusion at the same moment Fevai spoke it. Combination, she said. Varos nodded once. Yes. She turned toward him, scanner held loosely now, focus inward. I am looking at the marker distribution more carefully. The Lennian equivalent sequences in his genome are not randomly distributed. They cluster across 3 specific loci that we know are conserved in our own population for cognitive and perceptual function. Varos went still. His 1% is not 1% of anything, Fevai continued. It is a specific 1%. 3 alleles in 3 locations in a configuration that, within the standard model of human-Lennian genetic exchange, should not occur together. Each appears individually in roughly 1 in 8 humans of mixed pre-contact ancestry. The combination of all 3 has a baseline frequency I cannot calculate without a larger sample. It would be extremely small, possibly singular. Modern human populations do not typically contain Lennian genetic sequences at functional levels, Varos said. Correct. Direct Lennian populations do not express human genetic structures. Correct. And yet this configuration exists in him. And potentially in some unknown number of others who have not been measured for it because no one had a reason to look. Joseph had been following what he could. You're saying I'm both. Varos looked at him directly. You are neither. You are a recombination, a configuration that does not exist in either population as a standard expression. Joseph did not look reassured. Fevai lowered the scanner. The question is whether this configuration is unique to him or reproducible in principle. You are suggesting this response would occur in any offspring of a human-Lennian pairing. I am suggesting something more specific. She turned the scanner so he could see the marker overlay, 3 bright clusters against the otherwise unremarkable baseline. If this were simple crossbreeding, the response would track with overall Lennian genetic content. It does not. The object ignored you, and you have a complete Lennian genome. It responded to him, and he has 1%. What is being recognized is not Lennian ancestry. It is this configuration, which means somewhere in his lineage, on the human side, an ancestor either acquired or retained these 3 alleles in this exact arrangement, and the configuration has been carried forward intact through enough generations to appear in him without any visible cause. Varos considered it. An inheritance pattern that bypasses normal recombination, or one that has been actively maintained by selection pressure we have not identified. I do not know which. I would want a much larger sample before offering a hypothesis. And the implication of either is that the object was not designed to recognize Lennian ancestors, or human descendants. It was designed to recognize this, which implies the configuration itself was something the designers anticipated. Joseph, very quietly, anticipated by who? Neither of them answered. Varos set the question aside. If that were the case, the response would not be this isolated. There would be others. There may be, Fevai said. We have not escalated, he said, keeping his voice below the range that would carry. Fevai was already running her own calculations. She did not respond. Joseph stood between them, breathing faster, eyes fixed on the figures moving across the field toward them. What do we do? Varos did not look away from Threeheel. We adapt. The problem had changed in the time it had taken the shuttle to land. The threshold the object had been waiting for someone to cross. Joseph had already crossed it. Now everyone who mattered knew it, and Threeheel, who had calculated it in advance, had arrived to claim what came next. You have been listening to Part 3 of the Trappist Incident, Book 1, in R.M. Stratton's military science fiction series, Concord Horizon. If you have enjoyed the audiobook, the link to the ebook available on Amazon is in the description.